want to introduce our philosopher from MJC, Bill Anelli, who is one of the leaders of climate science or fighting climate change in the area. It's all yours, Bill.
Welcome everyone tonight, and I want to introduce Isabelle Haddad, who is currently a third-year PhD student in the Environmental Systems program at UC Merced. She was born and raised in upstate New York. I was raised in New Jersey, so East Coast. Okay. And she got her BA in Environmental Science from SUNY Environmental Science and Forestry program before coming to UC Merced. She worked in New York on sustainability efforts, developing her counties as Monroe County, Monroe County's first climate action plan. And now she's been working on, I believe, Modesto's climate action plan a little bit. You mentioned...
No, I'll be mentioning it,
You'll be
but
mentioning
I'm not
it.
involved.
Okay. Her current research has involved looking into equity, inclusion within climate action plans across the country, as well as equitable electric vehicle transitions. And she's also part of UC Merced's campus decarbonization core planning team as they move towards zero emissions campus. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the introduction. Let's get this open. Oh, okay. Okay, there we go. Okay, yeah, so thank you for the introduction. As mentioned, I'm Isabelle Haddad. I'm currently a PhD student at UC Merced, and my area of focus resides in, our lab works in urban sustainability, but as mentioned, I'm working with equity considerations and climate action planning, electric vehicle transitions, and today I wanted to bring a talk about climate and environmental justice and give some examples from the Central Valley, right close to home. And just to get us started, I want to see how familiar everyone is with climate change. I know we just heard a little bit about CO2 emissions, but can anyone, and you can just shout out too, tell me what climate change is? Yeah, so rise in temperatures and long-term changes in our weather patterns. Can anyone tell me the causes? Greenhouse gases, yeah. So we'll talk a little bit about how that all works, right? So greenhouse gases produce this natural greenhouse effect where solar radiation that gets beamed down to Earth gets radiated back out into the atmosphere, right? And these greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere help trap that solar radiation. And at normal levels, this is a good thing, right? We need stable temperatures and warm enough temperatures where we can survive and live. But with this human-enhanced greenhouse effect or anthropogenic effect, which because we've released so much more emissions and greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, that's trapping more solar radiation. And that's not such a good thing because then we're getting higher global temperatures, and that's creating an unstable system in the Earth, right? And climate variability has been a thing that's been happening for thousands of years now. And we can see from ice core data when we look at the carbon dioxide concentrations, historically, that it fluctuates, and that's a natural occurrence, and that also creates fluctuation in our temperatures and our climate. But we can see from this red line and from about 200 years to today, when we're thinking of industrialization and the mechanization of all of our processes, that we've been using fossil fuels for, which is creating lots of emissions, but particularly carbon dioxide, which is one of the most prominent greenhouse gases. And we can see that it's at 420, was mentioned. But this is creating an unstable thing for the Earth that's not prepared for. And this is just showing how, carbon dioxide concentrations are directly correlated to our global temperature increases. So we can see, a little bit past industrialization, but as these parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is increasing, we see that global temperature has risen to 1.1, 1.2 degrees Celsius, about 2 degrees Fahrenheit, which might not seem like a lot when we're thinking of day-to-day temperatures. I know, daily the temperature goes, maybe 30 degrees variable, but when we're thinking about it at a global scale, this creates lots of rippling effects. And when we're also thinking about emissions being, put out into the atmosphere at a global scale, it's not such an equal thing. When we look at cumulative emissions from 1750 to 2021, since industrialization, we can see the US is responsible for almost a quarter of all of those cumulative carbon dioxide emissions. And a lot of this has to do with our, leading countries, already developed countries, and it's kind of creating a paradox where our developing countries now are getting a lot of pressure put on them to be net zero using renewable energies, while a lot of these already developed countries that have already contributed to most of our emissions in the atmosphere aren't, taking the responsibility to combat that. And again, when we're looking at global emissions, specifically carbon dioxide, today, not just cumulative, we can see that, for example, China might be emitting the most total emissions right now. They emit, I think it's almost 30% of total global carbon dioxide. But when we're looking at it per capita and per person, total emissions divided by population, we can see that US is, far above that. There's lots of other countries far above that, but the northern hemisphere is contributing much more than the southern hemisphere. And even within countries, we see this disparity between wealthy emissions versus non-wealthy emissions, where the richest 10% are responsible for almost 50% or half of total lifestyle consumption emissions, and the poorest 50% are only responsible for about 10%. And this is kind of the essence of climate justice. When we're thinking about who is the least responsible for contributing to emissions and consequently climate change, and who's burdened with the most responsibility, and then who's also being burdened with most of the impacts from climate change. So a lot of different factors go into climate justice that we'll get into. But mostly we're trying to look at who's burdened with the impacts and who's being held responsible for combating these issues, right? And we're trying to think of what's an equitable way to create climate action and make sure that there's being a fair distribution of these burdens and benefits when we're going through that transition. So just to start with some climate change impacts, we talked about a little bit, and you guys can just shout out again if you have any more additions of what some examples of climate change impacts. Yeah, so sea level rise, we have that. We mentioned rising global temperatures, right? Changes in weather patterns, we mentioned sea level rise, which affects coastal cities the most. We also have loss of wildlife and biodiversity. And all of these also add up to food and health impacts. And we are seeing a lot of increased frequency of changes in weather events, right? So we can just raise our hands if we've been experiencing heat waves, wildfires and the effects of that, drought, flooding events. Yeah, so we'll get into examples of all of these. And to start, drought. California is a huge example of this. I know we've had a couple of wet seasons recently, but California was in a severe state of drought in 2021. And this is happening because of our increasing temperatures, the melting of glaciers in California's high elevations, which then lead to depletion of our freshwater reservoirs. And this impacts all Californians when we're thinking of like water accessibility. It also impacts the whole country when we're thinking of how California, and especially the Central Valley, has lots of agriculture and needs irrigation for that. I think we're responsible for more than 75% of fruits and nuts are grown in California that feed the nation. Also, I think a third of vegetables. So it impacts the country, it impacts the whole state, but it's also really impacting those within the Central Valley that rely on maybe shallow private wells, farmers that are relying on shallow private irrigation wells. And this is critical because over 2,000 wells had dried up during this critical drought period. And it's really hard for them to have the resources to recuperate after this, right? It's hard for the accessibility and especially these communities within the Central Valley that are already overburdened with all these impacts. And on the other hand, we have increased flooding events, right? This picture is from Modesto in 2023. And I know that even when we have some rain that might not seem like a lot from someone coming from upstate New York, when I'm driving home from school, there's, our streets are flooded and I'm like, what's going on? But a lot of the impacts fall on those people that are located within floodplains and flood zones that are most of our low-income communities. And they also have the lowest access to insurance. So when we're thinking about property damage, it's really hard for these communities to recuperate after events like this when they're bearing the most impacts from them. And then heat waves, which heat is definitely not a foreign concept for people in the Central Valley. We see 30% of voters saying that they have an extreme impact from heat within the Central Valley. And we know with climate change that these heat days and heat waves are only going to increase. We're going to see a number of hot days rise to 25, maybe more than 25 in certain areas by 2050. And there's a bunch of potential for major health issues like listed, especially in the Central Valley where we have already susceptible populations when we're thinking of asthma and air quality. And we've seen almost 5,000 hospitalizations, almost 11,000 emergency room visits, I think, within the past decade when it comes to health impacts from these heat waves. And when you think about Modesto, projection for 2050 looks like we're going to have 17 days, maybe more, of daily temperature exceeding 103 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the top 2% of all temperatures between 1961 and 1990. And so we're just seeing how this is going to be progressing, and we're going to have to deal with it in lots of ways. Again, wildfires. So this is also increasing because of climate-induced drought and higher temperatures. And when we see climate change temperatures, they're usually not getting low enough during the night, which is when these wildfires are usually being able to be dissipated or controlled. So we're going to see increases in that, but we also know that rural communities, rural census tracts, and those that are living within that wildland-urban interface area where wildfires are starting and then coming into developed and residential areas are those characterized by low income, linguistic isolation, and have higher proportions of elderly residents, which are those that are most prone to fire and smoke-related impacts. So this graphic is kind of an overview of everything we just kind of talked about, where different groups are vulnerable to different types of impacts, where children have higher risk of heat stroke and illness when we're talking about heat days. Older adults are more vulnerable during power outages caused by these extreme weather events, and low-income communities during flood events when there's not proper disaster management or that type of planning might be overcrowded in shelter conditions. And then lastly, we have communities of color being exposed to higher amounts of pollution. And this isn't particularly a climate change impact, right? But it's something, these pollutants are kind of causing climate change. And this concept is the essence of environmental justice. So environmental justice, we can't mention without mentioning Dr. Robert Bullard, who is coined kind of the father of environmental justice. And he has published 18 books on this concept, started in the 1980s. And it's this principle that states that all communities, regardless of income level, race, ethnicity, should all have the right to a healthy environment. And one of the most famous cases that some of you may have heard of was in Flint, Michigan, when their water was contaminated with lead. And this led to a huge variety of health impacts within that community, within a state that's nearly 80% white, but Flint, a city where more than half the population is black. And so this movement and legacy of environmental justice, since it's not new, it kind of has helped pave the way for climate justice to recognize the impacts of, disproportionate impacts from climate change. And just to differentiate between climate justice and environmental justice a bit more, they're very intertangled and they're addressed, in lots of ways in the same way, and they should be, but just to be able to give you a difference between the two, climate justice we know is disproportionate and unequal impacts from climate change, while environmental justice is disproportionate exposure to pollutants and environmental hazards that, for the most part, contribute to climate change. And environmental racism, which is closely tied with environmental justice, it's part of the concept, states where historical systemic inequities and practices such as redlining have created disinvestment in communities of color. This redlining is now illegal zoning and discriminatory housing practices within cities across the nation. We can see now have a huge impact on who's exposed to what. And particularly in California, there's a study that was done on these redline cities. And these communities of color are shown to face substantially higher pollution burdens, higher temperatures where we're seeing those urban heat islands, noise pollution, and environmental hazards. And again, this graphic is showing the disparity between who's contributing to pollution and who's bearing those impacts, where we're seeing Latinx Americans are exposed to 63% more air pollution than they're contributing to, versus white Americans are exposed to 17% less. And again, this graphic is showing race is one of the most significant predictors of where these hazardous sites are cited, where there's there's access to clean air and water, and where there's traffic usually, where you're getting exhaust pollution. I know when I was studying in Syracuse, we had the Freeway 180, where cars and trucks are going on every day, and there's that car pollution that you're exposed to, and the lowest income community within Syracuse was right underneath it. And one of the most important issues with this is that these things are cited near these communities because they know that they're not going to report it, or because their claims, like we see here, 95%, are not listened to. And one example I wanted to give within the Central Valley is Kettleman City. And Kettleman City is an unincorporated community within Kings County, and that means they don't have a local municipality government, and they're governed by the county. And where they have 1,100 residents, 95% Hispanic, and predominantly Spanish-speaking, and had a long history of toxic environmental exposures. In 1979, they had this toxic hazardous waste landfill sited right near their town, 3.5 miles right next to their town, where trucks are coming in every single day with toxic hazards like asbestos and benzene and getting dumped right next to them. Not to mention old oil fields and even just being in the Central Valley, the poor air quality that they're already exposed to. And Kettleman City is a great example of one of the first environmental justice movements. the same company that had that hazardous waste landfill proposed to put a hazardous waste incinerator in the same location, right? And these residents were thankfully alerted by a Greenpeace organizer, and they came together and formed People for Clean Air and Water and filed a lawsuit, and were thankfully successful in stopping this incinerator project because they found that the proper environmental impact assessments weren't being made for this proposed incinerator. And so progress is being made, but there's still progress to go, right? Because this hazardous waste landfill that was originally there is still there today, even after all these fines that have been placed on the same company. And just to shift to Central Valley as a whole, there's this CalEnviroscreen tool that takes pollution burden and population characteristics and spits out a score, CalEnviroscore. And they take pollution burden, which is, all of these compiled concentrations of ozone in the atmosphere, particulate matter, and exposure to environmental hazards, and then socio-demographic and economic characteristics that would make these communities more vulnerable to this pollution burden. And we can see that a lot of the red, which is the 90th percentile and highest scores, are within our Central Valley. And Modesto, so we can see here, there's areas in the red in Modesto, but we can see even within cities and towns that disparities exist. And when we look at these southern parts of Modesto and go in and click on it, we can see that their environmental hazard exposure is within that 90th percentile, right? Versus when you go and click on the green areas, they're 0 or close to 0 for environmental hazard exposure. And the population characteristics also correlate with that. So we can see even within towns and cities that I'm sure as you're driving around can even notice some of the differences between the environments. And this all goes to show that local action is also a huge component of this. So what's being done about all of this? We have climate policies at the international, national, and statewide scale. Planning, we have climate action plans, we have tools like the one I just mentioned, and we have community organizing, so nonprofits or other organizations and rallies or protests. And we're going to get into all of these. So climate policies. At the international level, we have the Paris Climate Accords, where all the countries came together and agreed we're going to stop global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, maybe 2 degrees Celsius now. And they all set emission reduction goals and renew those every 5 years. We also have the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, where they look at poverty alleviation, gender equality, climate action, and all those things that for developing nations to develop sustainably, those are all things that need to be incorporated. At the national level, we have Justice 40 initiative, which takes 40% of the benefits of these federal climate policies and energy policies and distributes them to our disadvantaged communities and overburdened communities. And we also have EJ Screen, which is the EPA's environmental justice screening tool, kind of like the CalEnviroscreen I showed, and at the national level, they show kind of the same indicators, environmental health exposures, and population characteristics to see which communities would benefit from which policies, like the Justice 40. And then statewide, here in California, we're very lucky that we have a lot of progressive climate policies, one being SB Senate Bill 32, which says that we want to reduce our emissions by 40% from 1990 levels by 2030. And another one, Senate Bill 535, which is disadvantaged community benefits, that these disadvantaged communities are designated disadvantaged through the CalEnviroscreen scores that I showed earlier, where the top 25% of scores are allocated benefits from our cap and trade program, that's another policy from California, and 25% of those profits from the cap and trade program are given to these disadvantaged communities. And we can see, again, Central Valley is kind of the heart of where a lot of these communities lie in California. And moving on to climate action planning, we know that globally we're trying to reduce our emissions, but we also know that cities contribute more than 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So localized climate action plans have gained traction as a result. And there's climate action plans at the state, regional level, but cities are kind of where they're being done the most. And the components of these climate action plans that we'll get into a little bit are mostly mitigation because we are trying to reduce our emissions, but also have adaptation and resiliency when we're already facing some of these climate change impacts that we're seeing. And then I'll also get into how equity has been integrated within these plans too. So just to get more into the components of climate action plans. So mitigation, we already mentioned, are those actions and strategies within plans to reduce emissions. And transportation is a huge part of this, right? So sustainable transportation, electrifying our transportation, and where's this energy coming from? Hopefully renewable energy, and also, transitioning a lot of our companies and mechanization processes to renewable energy. And then also energy efficient technology, and that includes energy retrofits, upgrades. And then on the other side of this is adaptation. So what are we doing to adapt and manage the risks that we're already facing from climate change, which includes emergency and disaster management from those extreme weather events that we mentioned earlier, such as flood protection, and then also making sure that our buildings and infrastructure are being built to withstand these events. And then, of course, these also overlap when we're thinking of, renewable energy, solar and storage, when we're thinking about power outages, and water and energy conservation. Because we've been so focused on adaptation and mitigation, there's lots of room to include equity considerations within this. And I want to just include one example of how equity can be incorporated in these plans. And energy burden, which is the percent of total household income that's being spent on energy, falls a lot on already disadvantaged communities, such as low income, those in multifamily housing, communities of color, and renters. And this can be addressed in our climate actions and strategies when we're thinking of where are the benefits from these energy retrofits or our weatherization. Are they going to our low-income housing and trying to alleviate some of this burden? And along the same lines, we also want to incorporate a just transition. And just transition started in the 1980s when workers were fighting for clean air and water regulations. But today, when we're thinking of transforming our economy from extractive to regenerative, it's this concept that a healthy economy and healthy environment can coexist. And there's this big notion that we're going to be losing a lot of jobs with this transition, but that also means we're gaining a lot of new green jobs. And so it's making sure that those vulnerable workers are incorporated in that transition and nobody's left behind. And I just wanted to give an overview of some of the different equity considerations and what different types are that can be incorporated in these plans. So procedural, distributed, and restorative. Procedural is the inclusion of communities within the planning and decision-making process itself. And this is super beneficial when we're trying to think about the actual needs of our communities and if they're actually being addressed. And there's distributive, which is the fair allocation of resources. And this can happen when we're thinking of mitigation techniques and adaptation techniques. Are these, going towards the communities that need them? Are we prioritizing them? And then there's restorative. That's probably the one that's left out the most, but maybe the most important when we're thinking about recognizing and rectifying the historical injustices, like we mentioned, redlining, that has created this disinvestment in communities of color, and how are we transforming and going into this climate action transition, trying to rectify this. And just to give you a quick plug on some of the research that I've been doing, I've been looking into equity considerations in climate action plans across the nation, and almost 30 of them I pulled out actions and indicators for. And indicators are kind of like the targets alongside these actions that help measure implementation progress. And I measured them against American Planning Association's Planning for Equity Guide and all their categories. And we can kind of see, most of them are concentrated within mobility and transportation, energy and resource consumption, climate change and resilience, which makes sense. But we can also see there's neglect in public space, housing, environmental justice, and gentrification. And when we're thinking about those different types of equity in the previous slide, we're kind of seeing that being neglected. And so the main takeaway from this, I would say, is when we're thinking of future decision makers and planners, how can we take a more holistic approach when we're tackling climate action? And transitioning to organizing, so climate rallies and protests. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Greta Thunberg, a youth climate activist. She started the Fridays for Future movement in 2018, and that was, students striking for climate. And that's created a lot of awareness and risen, attendance at these rallies, which is one of the main goals. But it's also calling for government action. And this is, we say through voting, but then also through public support, right? For these climate policies to be there in the first place, it needs public support. And there's lots of organizing and local organizations across the country. These are just a few within the Central Valley. And just to give an example of one, Central California's Environmental Justice Network, which works with community members and other stakeholders at different levels to identify environmental justice issues and develop solutions for them. And they've worked within Fresno and Kern counties, and their main focus is education, right? And they're educating youth and farm workers about pesticide exposures and the cumulative health impacts from that, and giving them the resources to know their rights about that too. And then looking even more locally, there's the Valley Improvement Projects that's focusing more in the northern part of the Central Valley and specifically Stanislaus County. And they worked with Stanislaus Sustainable Communities Coalition to develop recommendations for Modesto's general plan. And this is kind of tying all organizing climate policies and all that together when we're thinking of another climate policy from California, SB 1000, which states that all general plans in California need to incorporate all of these 7 categories of environmental justice. And so they brought community engagement towards this and developed recommendations for all these categories, which also incorporates procedural justice that we mentioned, right? And lastly, what can you do? So there's education, right? So you even being here right now, you're educating yourself, educating others, maybe sharing some of what you've learned, advocating for policy change, showing that public support for these climate policies that we talked about, and supporting local projects and organizations. And this can be getting involved in some of these organizations, volunteering, and there's lots of opportunities. Like we've seen, there's lots of organizations within this local Central Valley level. And end there. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions. And yes, this is just a picture of me taken last night as I'm thinking about climate change all the time. Thank you.